what you will hear and have started to hear very detailed, nuanced analysis. This is sort of the macro perspective on 25 years of autocratization across the globe. I'm going to build it on this year's democracy report, but also a couple of academic articles that we have published in extension of the work here. Building on VDEM's 31 million data on democracy, judiciaries, elections, and all that kind of stuff. Right, so where are we in the world? Well, this is the way the world looks according to our Liberal Democracy Index. It's a lot of red. A lot more red today, as you know, than 25 years ago. Including in Europe up here, right? Not least this country, of course, that we don't count as a democracy since about 2019. How did we get there? Well, here is the last 50 years, right? The Liberal Democracy Index, starting from 1974. What happened then? Karsten? Portugal! 25th of April, 1974, Portugal, Carnation Revolution. It almost looks like you have a well, anyway. And then the spread across the world. We had the end of the Cold War, right? And then there's a little dip here. Not too much, maybe. Should we worry? This is country averages, right? One country counts as much as the other country in this, right? Which, you know, it's like the UN, one country, one vote kind of thing. It means that the Seychelles out there in the Indian Ocean with 90,000 inhabitants weigh as much here as India with 1.4 billion people. Now, in terms of how much democracy we have in the world, does Seychelles mean as much for the world as India or China or now the United States? Maybe not, right? And then, of course, democracy is one man, one vote, right? Now women are part of this. It's great. Yes. So one person, one vote. So we can weigh this by population size. And then think of it as like, what's the level of democracy the average global citizen in some statistical sense enjoy? And then it looks like this. You have the same way up here, but then a downward trend that starts earlier and has gone much, much further. If we draw a red line back like this from the end of 2024, we end up in 1985, the year that Gorbachev came to power in then Soviet Union. That whole enormous expansion of freedoms and rights and liberalism that happened with the end of the Cold War, on a global scale, is gone, eradicated. Now we can weigh this in different ways. You can look at the world from different perspectives, right? So you can also, so we can weigh by territory. It looks very similar with this wave up, and then a downward trend that starts earlier and goes much further than the country averages, right? So you know already now that the last 25 years of autocratization has been on average large countries with large territories that also tends to impact the world much more than small countries. And look at this, the last graph maybe illustrates this. As share of world economy. Boom. Then we're back way before 1974, the beginning of the third wave of democratization. That graph tells you something about how much democracy is losing out in the world in terms of financial power. And this is before Trump derailing democracy in the United States during 2025. It also means now that 3 out of 4 people in the world now lives in autocracies. There are not that many left of us living in democracies. Okay, so we know where we are. Great, huh? Feeling happy? Then we can look at the countries right now in change. Democratizing, autocratizing. The world map looks like this. Yes, Brazil, getting rid of Bolsonaro, and the coalition party. Same with Donald Tusk in Poland. And so there are a few, but it's a lot of red again, right? And the point of showing the map is really that it's global. While the discussions here are a lot about Europe, it's a global trend. And it has been global for the past 25 years, which should tell you that in addition to the country-specific mechanisms that are out there, there should also be some global drivers. Here's how the last 50 years looks like in terms of this, right? So 1974 again, Carnation Revolution, right? Number of countries democratizing, end of Cold War, and like 71 countries at the same time moving ahead on democracy. Like, you remember, we were happy. We were looking forward to the future. Everything was getting better everywhere, right? You were born too late. I'm sorry. Frank Fukuyama, remember, he wrote a book, The End of History, right? Liberal democracy, boom. And meanwhile, in that same time, you could say in 25, maybe even 30 years, the number of countries autocratizing at the same time started to climb up. And this third wave of autocratization building up. There has never been as many countries autocratizing at the same time as now. We have data back to 1900. Since then, never. This is worse than the 1930s. You can say, okay, there are more countries in the world now than in the 1930s. There's never been a greater share of the countries in the world autocratizing at the same time as now. It's worse than the 1930s in that regard, too. There's never been a greater share of the world population living in countries autocratizing at the same time as now. No matter what metric we use here, it's worse than the 1930s. Also reminds about the 1930s in other regards that are too much for comfort for me. This wave is almost exclusively driven by far-right parties and leaders that are nationalistic, reactionary, and anti-pluralist. You guys talk a lot about illiberalism. I don't think that term should be used, but okay. But the thing is, they are anti-pluralistic. And it doesn't matter whether it's nationalist, reactionary, Erdogan in Turkey with a Muslim bent, or Hindu nationalism in Modi's India, Christian nationalism like here, or in Russia for that sake with the Orthodox Church, and the same with, of course, with Trump in the United States, Bolsonaro when he did his thing in Brazil and so on. And then it also reminds about the 1930s in some other regard. I'm going to do this very, very quickly, but just for the sake of the argument, I think. So in the 1930s, it was called propaganda. Radio was the new medium that was being used to then do away with democracy and introduce fascism, Nazism, and all that. Now, we call it disinformation, misinformation, driving, and the social media, internet. Before social media, it was alternative media on the net, spreading disinformation, increasing polarization, just like in the 1930s, and then leading to autocratization. The relationship between these three things are incredibly strong at the macro level. There are also numerous now micro-level studies showing the causal mechanisms. Right, we can look at it this way. Autocratizing countries, spread of government disinformation go up. Democratizing countries go down. Political polarization goes up, goes down. Right? Okay, this is averages over groups of countries. Let's look at the countries. So, government spread of disinformation in 2014 versus 2024. If you're above the line, it's gotten worse, more, right, higher. Red marked countries are autocratizing countries, blue mark countries, democratizing countries. Same thing with political polarization there. And if you're in the upper third here, we call it toxic polarization. That can be used then to pursue political enemies. If we look at it within countries over time, including this country, Hungary here, but then also Nicaragua, Serbia, indicators of political polarization, spread of disinformation, parties' use of hate speech go up, liberal democracy, red, goes down, up, down, and this is how it looks. This is not cherry picking, this is like a very general pattern. Now, there is some grounds for hope. So we also looked at this with resilience. Like among democratizing countries now, there are 19 of them, 10 of the 19 are what we call U-turns. They were autocratizing and then turned around relatively quickly. So here are the countries doing this at the end of 2024. The top ones, Brazil, Poland, Lesotho, Ecuador, Maldives, Zambia. Okay, so they all make these kind of U-turns. So we studied this in a paper published in Democratization, also a policy analysis for this. In terms of democratic resilience, of course, we have the countries that never start to autocratize. They have sort of onset resilience. But then we have breakdown resilience, Brazil. They stop autocratizing before turning it into an autocracy and turn around. And then you have the bouncing back, like they become electoral autocracies at least, and then turn around. Now, we looked at this from 1900 to the present. And these things were much more common than we thought. About half of all processes of autocratization are actually turned around relatively quickly. And even more surprising, the most common form of resilience then were bouncing back resilience. That is, you become an electoral autocracy for a few years, but manage to turn it around. Let's hope the United States managed to do that. I'm not so hopeful right now. But it has to happen relatively quickly. So, or it has to, but on average must. So within sort of, after autocratization sets in, then within sort of 5, 6 years, 7 at least, this has to happen. Otherwise you become sort of Erdogan's Turkey and stay down there for a long time. And there are a number of things that seems to be uniting many of the cases, not all the cases of U-turns, but important in many cases, right? So, large-scale popular mobilization. Lots of people out in the streets for a prolonged period of time. Not like they're doing in the United States now. No King's protests every 3 months. Yeah, great, you know. It's not going to change anything, right? You got to do South Korea and be out there like in 500,000 every day. The judiciary standing up, not bending over like here, but actually standing up and refuse to bend over to the executive. That was incredibly important in Brazil, for example. It was also important in Poland with some backing of the EU. If you think of it, peace had to try and create an alternative justice system, all that. It was also important in the United States in 2020, if you remember. They stood up. Now in the United States, not so much. Unified opposition, a coalition of parties that from left to right, we have very different ideas about taxation policy and stuff, but now we've got to save democracy. It's important in Zambia and other places too. And use the elections as that critical juncture where you can mobilize all the pro-democratic forces, sometimes get international support, to eventually unseat the incumbent. It doesn't always work. It didn't work in Venezuela, as you know. But when we see the U-turns, this is often very, very critical. On that note, let me say thank you. Everything we do in VDEM is transparent and open, accessible, including the 31 million data you can download and have fun with, like you guys have done sometimes. We also have these online tools for those who don't want to download 31 million data and open your statistical software. You can do all kinds of graphs like the ones I've shown you online. On that note, let me say thank you for listening, thank you for having me here, and inviting me to talk about this.